Rachel Thompson had lived alone in the old mountain cabin for 20 years. She was only 17 when she made the decision to leave everything behind. The small town where she grew up held too many painful memories. Her mother had died in a car accident, and her father became a stranger overnight, drowning his grief in bottles of whiskey. The cabin belonged to her grandfather, hidden deep in the Colorado mountains. It was a place where cell phones didn't work, and the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. Rachel thought it would be perfect for healing her broken heart. She never imagined she would stay for 2 decades. The first few years were the hardest. Rachel had to learn everything from scratch: how to chop wood for the fireplace, how to fix a leaky roof, how to hunt for food when winter supplies ran low. She made countless mistakes. She burned dinner more times than she could count. She got lost in the forest and spent a whole night shivering under a tree before finding her way home. But slowly, Rachel adapted to mountain life. She grew her own vegetables in a small garden behind the cabin. She learned to preserve food for winter months. She trained herself to wake up with the sunrise and sleep when darkness fell. The mountains became her world, and she became part of theirs. Rachel avoided all contact with people, especially women. She had convinced herself that relationships only brought pain. Every few months, she would drive her old pickup truck to the nearest town to buy supplies. She always went to the same small store, spoke only when necessary, and left as quickly as possible. The store owner, an elderly man named Frank, never asked questions. He seemed to understand that some people needed their space. Years passed, like seasons changing. Rachel watched snow cover the mountains in winter and wildflowers bloom in spring. She saw deer drinking from the stream near her cabin and eagles soaring above the peaks. She read books by candlelight and listened to the wind singing through the trees. It was a peaceful life, but also a lonely one. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Rachel would sit on her porch and wonder what her life might have been like if she had stayed in town. Would she have married someone? Would she have children? Would she have friends who cared about her? These thoughts always made her sad, so she learned to push them away. The mountains kept her secrets and never judged her choices. They watched as the young girl grew into a woman. They saw her hair grow longer and her hands grow stronger from years of hard work. They witnessed her tears on difficult days and her rare smiles when she felt truly content. Rachel created routines that kept her busy and gave her purpose. Every morning she would check her vegetable garden and tend to her chickens. She had 6 hens that provided fresh eggs. She named each one but tried not to get too attached. In the afternoon, she would work on maintaining the cabin. There was always something that needed fixing or improving. Evenings were for reading and planning. Rachel had collected hundreds of books over the years, ordering them from catalogs and having them delivered to the town post office. She read everything from adventure novels to books about survival and gardening. Knowledge became her companion during the long, silent nights. As the 20th year of her isolation approached, Rachel began to feel restless in ways she couldn't explain. The mountains that had once felt like a protective embrace now seemed to whisper questions she didn't want to answer. She found herself standing at her window more often, looking toward the distant road that connected her world to the one she had left behind. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Rachel woke up before dawn, made coffee on her wood-burning stove, and stepped outside to breathe the crisp mountain air. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink and orange. Birds were starting their daily songs. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. But as Rachel walked toward her garden to check on her tomatoes, she heard something unusual. It was a sound she hadn't heard in 20 years. A human voice, calling for help. The voice was weak and desperate, barely audible above the morning breeze. Rachel froze, unsure if she had imagined it. Then she heard it again, clearer this time. Someone was in trouble, and they were close to her cabin. After 2 decades of avoiding all human contact, Rachel was about to face the biggest challenge of her isolated life. The voice belonged to a woman, and she was asking for help. Rachel's heart pounded as she followed the sound of the voice. Her legs felt shaky after 20 years of avoiding any human contact. The voice came from somewhere in the thick forest behind her cabin. She grabbed an axe from her woodshed, not sure if she would need it for protection or to help whoever was calling. The forest was dense with pine trees and thick undergrowth. Rachel pushed through branches and stepped over fallen logs, following the desperate cries that grew louder with each step. Her hands were sweating despite the cool morning air. She hadn't spoken to another person in months, and now she was about to help a complete stranger. After walking for about 10 minutes, Rachel saw something that made her stop breathing. A young woman was tied to a large oak tree with thick rope. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Her dark hair was tangled with leaves and twigs. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. She looked like she had been there all night. The woman's eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion. When she saw Rachel approaching, she began crying with relief. "Please help me," she whispered in a hoarse voice. "I've been here since yesterday afternoon. I thought no one would find me." Rachel stood frozen for a moment, staring at the first person she had seen up close in years. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, with kind brown eyes that reminded Rachel of her mother. Despite her terrible situation, there was something gentle about her face that made Rachel feel less afraid. "Who did this to you?" Rachel asked, surprised by how rusty her own voice sounded. She hadn't used it much lately except to talk to her chickens. "Two men," the woman replied weakly. "They kidnapped me from the hiking trail yesterday. They said they would come back for me today. Please, we need to hurry." Rachel's survival instincts kicked in immediately. She had spent 20 years learning how to handle dangerous situations in the wilderness. This was different, but her mountain training had taught her to stay calm and think clearly during emergencies. She used her axe to cut through the ropes carefully, making sure not to hurt the woman. The rope was thick and new, suggesting the kidnappers had planned this carefully. Rachel's hands shook as she worked, partly from adrenaline and partly from the strange feeling of helping another human being after so long alone. "Can you walk?" Rachel asked as the last rope fell away. The woman rubbed her wrists where the rope had left red marks. She tried to stand but stumbled. Rachel caught her arm to steady her. It was the first time she had touched another person in 20 years. The contact felt electric and overwhelming. "I think so," the woman said. "My legs are numb from being tied up all night. Give me a minute." Rachel helped her stretch and walk a few steps. "We need to get to my cabin quickly. If those men are coming back, we don't want to be here." She looked around nervously, scanning the trees for any signs of danger. As they made their way back through the forest, the woman introduced herself. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a teacher from Denver. I come hiking in these mountains every summer." She paused to catch her breath. "I never expected something like this to happen." Rachel hesitated before responding. She hadn't said her own name out loud to another person in years. "I'm Rachel Thompson. I live in the cabin up ahead." Sarah looked surprised. "You live out here? All alone? How long have you been here?" 20 years, Rachel answered simply. Sarah stopped walking and stared at her. 20 years? But you look so young. You must have been just a teenager when you came here." "I was 17, Rachel confirmed, feeling uncomfortable with all the questions. They reached the cabin just as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Rachel helped Sarah up the front steps and through the door she rarely opened to anyone. The cabin was small but neat, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Sarah looked around in amazement. "This is incredible. You built this life completely by yourself?" Rachel nodded and helped Sarah sit in the comfortable chair by the fireplace. She brought her a cup of water and some bread with jam. Sarah ate hungrily, clearly exhausted from her ordeal. "We should call the police," Sarah said between bites. Rachel's stomach dropped. "There's no phone here, no cell service either. We're completely cut off from the outside world." Sarah's face went pale. "Then how do we get help? Those men could come back looking for me." Rachel had been thinking the same thing. She walked to the window and looked out at the forest. Everything appeared calm, but she knew that could change quickly. She had weapons and knew how to use them, but she had never had to protect another person before. My truck is in the shed, Rachel said. We could drive to town and find help there. But it's a long, rough road, and if those men are watching, they might see us leaving. Sarah stood up unsteadily. We have to try. I can't stay here waiting for them to come back. Rachel felt torn between her instinct to help Sarah and her deep fear of returning to the world she had avoided for 20 years. The thought of going back to town, facing people, answering questions, made her feel sick. But looking at Sarah's frightened face, she knew she had no choice. All right, Rachel said, grabbing her truck keys from a hook by the door. But we need to be very careful. And Sarah? She looked directly into the other woman's eyes. Once we get to town and you're safe, I'm coming back here. This is my home and I don't plan to leave it again. Rachel led Sarah to the old wooden shed behind her cabin where she kept her pickup truck. The red truck was 20 years old but well maintained. Rachel had learned to fix engines and change oil during her years of isolation. She knew every part of that truck like it was a faithful friend. As Rachel started the engine, Sarah climbed into the passenger seat and looked around nervously. How long will it take to reach town? She asked. About 45 minutes on the mountain roads, Rachel replied, backing out of the shed. The path is rough and winding. We need to go slow to avoid sliding off the cliff edges. They drove in. Silence for the first few minutes. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She hadn't been this far from her cabin in over a year. The familiar trees and rocks along the road looked the same, but everything felt different with another person beside her. Sarah broke the silence. Rachel, can I ask you something? Why did you choose to live alone for so long? It must have been incredibly difficult. Rachel kept her eyes on the winding road ahead. She had never explained her story to anyone, not even to herself most days. I lost my mother when I was young. My father couldn't handle the grief. I decided it was easier to be alone than to risk losing someone else I cared about. But 20 years, Sarah said softly. Didn't you ever get lonely? Every day, Rachel admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. But lonely felt safer than heartbroken. They drove around a sharp curve and Rachel suddenly hit the brakes hard. A large tree had fallen across the road, blocking their path completely. The trunk was too big to move and too high to drive over. This wasn't here yesterday when I went to town for supplies, Rachel said, getting out to examine the obstacle. Sarah joined her and they both stared at the massive pine tree stretching from one side of the road to the other. Sarah walked around the tree, looking for any way to get past it. Rachel, look at this. She pointed to the base of the tree. This wasn't cut down by wind or lightning. Someone used a chainsaw. You can see the clean cuts. Rachel's blood ran cold. She examined the cuts and realized Sarah was right. They blocked the road on purpose. They knew we might try to escape this way. As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of another vehicle approaching from behind them. Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm. We need to hide, now. They ran into the dense forest, beside the road just as a black Jeep came around the curve. Two men got out and began examining Rachel's truck. One was tall and thin with a scraggly beard. The other was shorter but muscular, with tattoos covering his arms. They're definitely in there, the tall man said loudly. The engine is still warm. Find them, the shorter man replied in a rough voice. They can't have gone far. Rachel and Sarah crouched behind a cluster of thick bushes, trying to control their breathing. Rachel's mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't go forward because of the fallen tree, and they couldn't go back because the men would see them. The men split up and began searching the forest on both sides of the road. Rachel knew these mountains better than anyone, but she also knew that two people moving through the wilderness would leave tracks that experienced hunters could follow. We need to get higher up the mountain, Rachel whispered in Sarah's ear. There's an old mining cave about half a mile from here. We can hide there until they give up looking. Sarah nodded, and they began moving carefully through the trees, stepping on rocks and fallen logs to avoid leaving footprints in the soft forest floor. Rachel led the way, using skills she had developed during her 20 years of mountain living. The climb was steep and difficult. Sarah struggled to keep up, still weak from her night tied to the tree. Rachel had to help her several times when she stumbled or slipped on loose rocks. Despite the danger, Rachel found herself caring about Sarah's well-being in a way that surprised her. After 20 minutes of climbing, they reached the entrance to the old mining cave. It was hidden behind a waterfall that trickled down the mountainside. Rachel had discovered it during her 3rd year in the mountains and had sometimes used it as shelter during severe storms. Inside the cave, they sat on the rocky floor and caught their breath. The sound of the waterfall masked their voices, making it safe to talk quietly. "How did you know about this place?" Sarah asked, looking around at the cave walls that sparkled with mineral deposits. "I've explored every inch of these mountains." "Over the years," Rachel replied. "When you live alone, you need to know all the safe places to hide." Sarah studied Rachel's face in the dim light filtering through the waterfall. "You're not just a hermit, are you? You're a survivor. You've built an entire life up here, and you're incredibly strong." Rachel felt uncomfortable with the compliment. She had never thought of herself as strong. "I just did what I had to do to stay alive." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Most people wouldn't last 20 days alone in the wilderness, let alone 20 years. You've accomplished something amazing even if you don't see it that way." They heard voices outside the cave echoing off the rocky mountainside. The 2 men were still searching for them, getting closer to their hiding spot. "We should stay here until dark," Rachel whispered. "Then we can make our way back to the cabin. I have weapons there and I know the area well enough to defend us." Sarah grabbed Rachel's hand. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Maybe I should just give myself up and tell them to leave you alone." "Absolutely not," Rachel said with more force than she intended. "We're in this together now. I'm not letting them take you." As they sat in the cave waiting for darkness, Rachel realized that something fundamental had changed in her life. For the first time in 20 years, she was responsible for someone else's safety. The thought terrified her, but it also awakened something inside her that had been sleeping for 2 decades. She looked at Sarah's face, illuminated by the soft light from the waterfall, and wondered if this was how connections between people were supposed to feel. Scary and wonderful at the same time. As darkness fell over the mountains, Rachel and Sarah prepared to leave their hiding place in the cave. The voices of the 2 men had faded hours ago, but Rachel knew they could still be waiting somewhere in the forest. "Stay close behind me," Rachel whispered as they stepped carefully through the waterfall. "Step exactly where I step. The mountain is different at night, and one wrong move could send us tumbling down a cliff." The moon was only half full, providing just enough light to see the outline of trees and rocks. Rachel moved through the forest like a ghost, her feet finding safe paths that she had traveled hundreds of times over the years. Sarah followed as quietly as she could, impressed by how Rachel seemed to know every root and stone even in complete darkness. They made their way down the mountain slowly, stopping frequently to listen for any sounds that didn't belong to the natural night chorus of owls and insects. Rachel's senses were sharp from years of living alone in the wilderness. She could hear a twig snap from 50 feet away and smell a campfire from half a mile distance. After an hour of careful descent, they reached the area near Rachel's cabin. Everything appeared normal, but Rachel felt uneasy. Something was different, though she couldn't identify what it was. "Wait here," she told Sarah, positioning her behind a large boulder. "Let me check the cabin first." Rachel crept forward alone, moving from tree to tree until she had a clear view of her home. What she saw made her heart sink. The front door was hanging open and yellow light spilled out from inside. The men had found her cabin and were inside, probably searching through her belongings. She circled around to the back of the cabin and peered through the kitchen window. The tall man with the beard was sitting at her dining table, eating from a can of her food. The shorter man was going through her bookshelves, throwing books onto the floor. "She's got to come back eventually," she heard the bearded man say. "This is obviously where she lives. Look at all this stuff." "We should burn it down," the shorter man replied angrily. "That would bring her running." "No, we wait. She cares about this place. She'll come back, and when she does, we'll have both of them." Rachel's hands clenched into fists. These men had invaded her sanctuary, the one place in the world where she felt safe. They were touching her things, destroying the home she had built with her own hands over 20 years. She made her way back to Sarah, who was waiting anxiously behind the boulder. "They're inside my cabin," Rachel reported quietly. "They're planning to wait there until we return." Sarah's face fell. "I'm so sorry, Rachel. This is all my fault. They're destroying your home because of me." "This isn't your fault," Rachel said firmly. "You didn't choose to be kidnapped. But now we need to figure out how to get them out of there." They spent the next hour developing a plan. Rachel knew her property better than anyone. She had built secret hiding places and escape routes during her early years there, when she was still afraid that her father might try to find her and force her to come home. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin that they probably don't know about," Rachel explained. "I keep supplies there, including a hunting rifle and ammunition. If I can get to it without them seeing me, we'll have a chance to defend ourselves." Sarah shook her head. "That sounds too dangerous. What if they catch you?" "Then you run," Rachel said simply. "You follow this stream downhill until you reach the main river. Follow the river east for about 5 miles until you find the old logging bridge. Cross it and keep walking until you hit the highway. Flag down a car and get help." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said with determination that surprised them both. Rachel looked at her in the moonlight. "Sarah, you don't understand. I've been preparing for situations like this my entire adult life. I know how to handle dangerous people in the wilderness. But I can't do it effectively if I'm worried about protecting you at the same time." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached out and took Rachel's hand. 20 years ago, you ran away because you were afraid of losing someone you cared about. Are you really going to push me away now for the same reason?" The question hit Rachel like a physical blow. She realized that Sarah was right. Without meaning to, she had begun to care about this stranger who had stumbled into her life. The thought of something happening to Sarah made her feel the same panic she had experienced when her mother died. "I don't know how to do this," Rachel admitted. "I don't know how to care about someone and still think clearly." "Then we'll figure it out together," Sarah said softly. "But we're not separating. Whatever happens, we face it as a team." Rachel took a deep breath and nodded. Having a partner felt strange and frightening, but also somehow right. "All right, here's what we're going to do." She outlined a new plan that involved both of them working together. Sarah would create a distraction on one side of the cabin while Rachel approached the root cellar from the other side. Once Rachel had the rifle, they would have the advantage they needed to confront the intruders. As they prepared to put their plan into action, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. She felt like she was part of a team. Despite the danger they faced, there was comfort in knowing that someone else cared about the outcome as much as she did. "Rachel," Sarah said as they prepared to separate, "whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that meeting you has been extraordinary. You've shown me what real courage looks like." Rachel felt her cheeks warm despite the cool night air. "You've shown me what I've been missing all these years. I never realized how lonely I was until I wasn't lonely anymore." They squeezed each other's hands once, then moved into position. Rachel watched Sarah disappear into the shadows, heading toward the front of the cabin. For the first time in 20 years, Rachel Thompson was fighting not just for her own survival, but for something even more precious. She was fighting for the chance to discover what her life might become with someone else in it. Rachel crept through the darkness toward the back of her cabin, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the men inside could hear it. She had spent 20 years avoiding confrontation, choosing isolation over conflict. Now she was about to face two dangerous strangers to protect someone she had known for less than 24 hours. The root cellar was hidden beneath a wooden trapdoor covered with dirt and pine needles. Rachel had built it during her second year in the mountains, when winter supplies were running low and she realized she needed a secure place to store food and emergency equipment. She brushed away the camouflage and slowly lifted the heavy door, praying it wouldn't creak. Inside the dark cellar, her hands found the familiar shape of her hunting rifle. She had used it many times to hunt deer and elk for food, but never against another human being. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, with the implications of what she might have to do. She loaded the rifle with practiced efficiency and grabbed extra ammunition. As she climbed out of the cellar, she heard Sarah's voice from the front of the cabin, executing their plan perfectly. "Help!" Sarah called out in a panicked voice. "Please, someone help me. I'm lost and injured." Rachel heard chairs scraping inside the cabin as the two men reacted to Sarah's calls. Through the kitchen window, she watched them grab flashlights and move toward the front door. "You stay here in case it's a trick," the bearded man told his partner. "I'll go check it out." Rachel's plan was working. With one man outside looking for Sarah and the other staying inside, she would have a chance to get the upper hand. She moved silently around the side of the cabin, keeping to the shadows. The bearded man emerged from the front door with a flashlight, scanning the area where Sarah's voice had come from. "Where are you?" he called out. "Keep talking so I can find you." Sarah continued calling for help from different locations, making it sound like she was stumbling around lost in the forest. She was leading the man away from the cabin, giving Rachel the opportunity she needed. Rachel slipped through the back door into her own kitchen, moving as quietly as possible. The shorter man was standing by the front window, watching his partner search outside. His back was turned to Rachel and he was completely focused on the activity outside. "Don't move," Rachel said in a steady voice, pointing the rifle at the man's back. The man froze, his hands slowly rising into the air. "Easy there, lady. We don't want any trouble. You should have thought about that before you kidnapped someone." "And broke into my home," Rachel replied, surprised by how calm she sounded. "Put your hands on your head and turn around slowly." The man complied, and Rachel got her first close look at one of her tormentors. He was younger than she had expected, maybe in his early 30s, with scared eyes that didn't match his tough appearance. "Look, we can work this out," he said nervously. "We were just going to ask for some money and let the girl go. No one has to get hurt." "You tied a woman to a tree and left her there all night," Rachel said coldly. "You terrorized her and then invaded my home. This is way past working anything out." Outside, she could hear the bearded man getting frustrated as he searched for Sarah. "Where are you?" he shouted into the forest. "I know you're out there." Rachel knew she had to act quickly before he gave up and returned to the cabin. "Call your friend back here," she ordered the man in front of her. "I can't do that," he replied. "He'll know something's wrong." "Then we have a problem," Rachel said, tightening her grip on the rifle. At that moment, Sarah appeared in the doorway behind the searching man. She had found a large stick and was creeping up behind him. Rachel watched through the window as Sarah raised the stick and brought it down hard on the back of the man's head. He collapsed to the ground, his flashlight rolling away into the darkness. Sarah looked up and saw Rachel through the window. She gave a thumbs-up signal and quickly dragged the unconscious man's body away from the door. "Your partner just got knocked out by the woman you kidnapped," Rachel informed her prisoner. "And now you're going to tell me exactly why you did this." The man's tough demeanor crumbled completely. "It wasn't my idea, I swear. Danny, the guy, outside, he owed some people money. They said if we could grab someone from the hiking trails and hold them for ransom, they'd forgive his debt. So you chose to destroy an innocent person's life to solve your financial problems," Rachel said, with disgust. "We weren't going to hurt her," the man protested. "We were just going to ask her family for money and let her go. You left her tied to a tree overnight, in the wilderness, with wild animals around. She could have died." The man looked genuinely ashamed. "I know it was wrong. I wanted to bring her food and water, but Danny said it was too risky to go back." Sarah entered through the back door, slightly out of breath but smiling triumphantly. "Your friend is going to have a serious headache when he wakes up, but he'll live. I tied him up with some rope I found in your shed." Rachel felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had gone from victim to partner in the span of a single day. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "Actually, I feel better than I have since this whole thing started. There's something empowering about fighting back instead of just being afraid." They spent the next hour securing both men and deciding what to do with them. Rachel's cabin still had no phone service, so they couldn't call police immediately. But with their captors tied up and disarmed, they had time to figure out their next steps. As dawn approached, Rachel made coffee, and Sarah found some bread and jam. They sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast while keeping watch over their prisoners. An incredibly surreal situation for someone who had eaten alone for 20 years. "What happens now?" Sarah asked between bites of toast. Rachel looked around her cabin, seeing it differently than she had just yesterday. The walls that had protected her from the world now felt less like barriers and more like boundaries that could be crossed when she chose to cross them. "Now we take them to town and turn them over to the police," Rachel said. "And then I guess we figure out what comes next." Sarah smiled. "Do you think you might consider having visitors sometimes? I mean, after we get through all the legal stuff with these guys?" Rachel felt that familiar flutter of fear in her chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Hope, maybe, or curiosity about what her life might look like with someone else in it occasionally. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I might be ready to try something new." 3 hours later, Rachel found herself driving her truck down the mountain road with Sarah beside her and 2 tied-up criminals in the back. It was the strangest caravan she could have imagined 24 hours earlier. The fallen tree had been moved aside by the time they reached it, probably by the men themselves when they first blocked the road. The drive to town gave Rachel time to think about what would happen once they arrived. She would have to talk to police officers, answer questions, possibly go to court as a witness. After 20 years of avoiding all human contact, the thought made her stomach churn with anxiety. "You don't have to say much," Sarah said, as if reading her thoughts. "Just tell them what happened. You saved my life, Rachel. You're the hero in this story." Rachel didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had been thrown into deep water and discovered she could swim after spending 20 years convinced she would drown. The town looked different than Rachel remembered. There were new buildings and unfamiliar signs. 20 years of changes that had happened while she was living in her mountain bubble. But the police station was still in the same location, a small brick building with 2 police cars parked outside. Officer Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional manner, listened to their story with growing amazement. She kept looking back and forth between Rachel and Sarah, as if trying to make sure she was hearing correctly. "Let me get this straight," Officer Martinez said. "Ms. Thompson, you've been living alone in the mountains for 20 years, and you captured these 2 men by yourself?" "We captured them together," Rachel corrected, glancing at Sarah. Sarah did half the work. The questioning took most of the morning. Rachel had to tell her story several times to different people. Detective Johnson, a tall man with gray hair, was particularly interested in how she had survived alone for so long. "You might be the most self-sufficient person I've ever met," he said with genuine admiration. "Most people can't handle a weekend of camping, and you built an entire life up there." The 2 criminals, Danny and his partner Mike, confessed to everything once they realized they were caught. Danny owed $15,000 to some dangerous people in Denver. Mike had agreed to help him with the kidnapping plan because Danny was his brother, and he didn't want to see him get hurt. "They'll probably get 5 to 10 years each," Officer Martinez explained to Rachel and Sarah. "Kidnapping is a serious, federal crime, even if no one was physically harmed." As the legal proceedings continued, Rachel found herself spending more and more time in town. There were statements to give, forms to fill out, and court appearances to attend. She stayed in a small motel near the police station, the first indoor plumbing and electricity she had used regularly in 20 years. Sarah stayed in town too, extending her vacation to help with the legal process. They had dinner together every evening, talking about everything and nothing. Rachel learned that Sarah taught 3rd grade in Denver, loved hiking and reading, and had never been married because she hadn't found the right person. "What about you?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on the motel balcony watching the sunset. "Did you ever think about relationships before you went to the mountains?" Rachel considered the question. "I had a boyfriend in high school, Tommy Patterson. He was sweet and kind, but after my mother died, I couldn't bear the thought of caring about someone and potentially losing them. So I broke up with him before I left town." "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" "Every day for the first 5 years," Rachel admitted. "After that, I convinced myself I had made the right choice. But meeting you has made me realize that maybe I was just scared." Sarah reached over and took Rachel's hand. You were 17 and dealing with incredible grief. You did what you needed to do to survive. There's no shame in that. 3 weeks after the kidnapping, the legal proceedings were mostly complete. Danny and Mike had been formally charged and were awaiting trial. Sarah's statement had been recorded, and Rachel's testimony had been taken. There was nothing keeping either of them in town anymore. I should probably head back to Denver soon, Sarah said as they packed up their motel rooms. School starts in a few weeks and I need to prepare my classroom. Rachel felt a familiar panic rising in her chest. Of course, you have your life to get back to. Sarah stopped packing and turned to face her. Rachel, what do you want to happen between us? The direct question caught Rachel off guard. She had been avoiding thinking about the future, focusing only on getting through each day. I don't know, she said honestly. I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in 20 years. But I don't know if I'm capable of being in a relationship. What if we started slowly? Sarah suggested. I could visit you at the cabin sometimes. Maybe you could come to Denver occasionally. We don't have to figure everything out right now. Rachel considered this. The idea of Sarah visiting her mountain home felt both terrifying and wonderful. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm too damaged from all those years alone? What if you're not? Sarah replied. What if you're exactly who you're supposed to be and those 20 years made you into someone amazing? That afternoon, Rachel drove back to her cabin alone while Sarah headed to Denver. The mountains looked the same, but Rachel felt completely different. The silence that had once comforted her now felt empty. She found herself listening for Sarah's voice and looking toward the road, hoping to see her truck. She spent the next 2 weeks trying to settle back into her old routines. She tended her garden, repaired damage to the cabin from the break-in, and read books by candlelight. But everything felt different now. The solitude that had protected her for 20 years now felt like a choice rather than a necessity. On a Thursday morning, Rachel heard the sound of a car approaching her cabin. Her heart jumped, hoping it might be Sarah, but a different vehicle appeared. It was Tommy Patterson, her high school boyfriend, now a middle-aged man with gray temples and kind eyes that looked exactly the same as she remembered. Hello, Rachel, he said as he got out of his car. I heard you were back in contact with the world. I hoped you might be willing to see an old friend. They talked for hours on her front porch. Tommy had married his college girlfriend, raised 3 children, and now worked as a veterinarian in town. His wife had died of cancer 2 years earlier, and he understood something about grief and isolation. I always wondered what happened to you, he said. Your father never talked about where you went. He died about 10 years ago, by the way. Liver disease. Rachel felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Her father's death meant she was truly free from her past now. I heard about what you did for that teacher from Denver, Tommy continued. The whole town is talking about how brave you were. I wasn't brave, Rachel protested. I was terrified the entire time. Sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're terrified, Tommy said with a smile. After Tommy left, Rachel sat on her porch thinking about courage and choices. She thought about Sarah, probably preparing her classroom for a new group of 8-year-olds. She thought about the life she had built in the mountains and the life she might build if she was willing to take risks again. 2 days later, Sarah's car appeared on the mountain road. Rachel's heart soared as she watched her climb out of the vehicle carrying a backpack and a grocery bag. I brought supplies for the weekend, Sarah announced. I hope you don't mind surprise visitors. Rachel ran down from the porch and hugged Sarah tightly, surprising them both with the intensity of her relief and joy. I minded being alone more than I thought I would, Rachel admitted. They spent the weekend hiking through Rachel's favorite places in the mountains. Sarah was amazed by the hidden waterfalls, the meadows full of wildflowers, and the caves Rachel had discovered over the years. In return, Sarah shared stories about her students and her life in the city. On Sunday evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Sarah made a proposal. What if I took a sabbatical next year? I could spend a few months up here with you, helping you decide what you want your life to look like going forward. Rachel stared at her in amazement. You would do that? Give up your job and your life in Denver? It's just a sabbatical, not giving up anything permanently, Sarah clarified. But yes, I would do that. These past few weeks have shown me what I've been missing. I want to see what we might become together. Rachel thought about all the years she had spent protecting herself from exactly this kind of connection. She thought about her mother's death and her father's grief and her own fear of losing someone she loved. Then she looked at Sarah's face full of hope and determination and realized that some risks were worth taking. Yes, she said simply. I want to try. 6 months later, Rachel Thompson was no longer completely alone on her mountain. Sarah had moved into the cabin temporarily while on sabbatical from teaching. They were learning how to live together, how to share space and decisions and daily routines. It wasn't always easy, but it was never boring. Rachel had also begun making occasional trips to town, reconnecting with old acquaintances like Tommy Patterson and slowly building relationships with new people. She was still most comfortable in the mountains, but the world beyond her cabin no longer seemed like enemy territory.